If you try to track Archie Bunker's journey across All in the Family like a traditional character arc, looking for clear turning points, big transformations, or moments where everything suddenly shifts into a new version of who he is, you'll probably feel like something is missing, because Archie doesn't change in that kind of visible, dramatic way. And that's exactly what makes his evolution over 9 seasons so fascinating, so frustrating at times, and ultimately so real. Because the truth is, Archie does change, but not in a straight line, not in a way that announces itself, not in a way that rewards you with a clear before and after. Instead, his change happens slowly, unevenly, almost reluctantly, like something that occurs in the background while the louder parts of his personality continue to dominate the foreground. And if you're not paying close attention, it's easy to miss. In the early seasons, what stands out most is the certainty. The confidence in his worldview feels complete, almost unshakable, as if every conversation is an opportunity to reinforce something he already believes rather than reconsider it. He reacts quickly, speaks with authority, and approaches disagreement as something to push back against rather than something to sit with. And that immediacy, that lack of hesitation, gives the impression of a character who is fixed, defined, finished. But even in those early moments, if you watch closely, there are small cracks, tiny pauses, reactions that linger just a fraction longer than expected. Moments where something doesn't fully align, where his response feels slightly delayed, as if something underneath the surface is catching up with him. And those moments, they don't change him right away. They don't lead to a sudden realization, but they stay. They accumulate. And that accumulation is where the real change begins. Because as the seasons progress, what you start to notice isn't a shift in what Archie believes, at least not in any obvious way, but a shift in how he holds those beliefs. The certainty is still there, but it becomes more reactive, more defensive, less like something that stands on its own, and more like something that needs to be protected. And that's a subtle but important difference, because it suggests that the world around him is having an impact, even if he isn't openly acknowledging it. And that impact comes largely through the people closest to him. Mike, for example, doesn't change Archie in a direct sense. The arguments don't end with Archie adopting a new perspective. But they do something else. They introduce friction. They force Archie to engage with ideas he would otherwise ignore. They create a kind of ongoing pressure that doesn't resolve but doesn't disappear either. And over time, that pressure begins to show, not in what Archie says, but in how he says it. In the moments where his responses feel slightly less automatic. In the times where he circles back, repeats himself, reinforces his position more forcefully than before, as if trying to stabilize something that feels less certain than it used to. And that's where the change becomes visible, not as growth in the traditional sense, but as adaptation. A shift in posture rather than position. Gloria adds another layer to this, Because with her, the conflict isn't just intellectual, it's emotional. And across the seasons, you can see how Archie navigates that differently. There are moments in the earlier episodes where the emotional weight of their relationship feels secondary to the argument itself, where the need to be right overrides everything else. But later on, there's a subtle shift. Not a complete change, not a consistent pattern, but a noticeable presence of something softer. The moments where the tone lowers, where the reaction is less immediate, where the relationship seems to take up more space than the disagreement. And again, these moments don't redefine him. They don't erase the tension, but they exist. And because they exist, they add complexity. And then and if there's one relationship that most clearly reveals how Archie changes over time, it's this one. Because doesn't challenge Archie through confrontation. She doesn't try to dismantle his beliefs. Instead, she creates a different kind of environment, one where patience replaces urgency, where kindness interrupts tension, where understanding exists without the need to win. And Archie's response to that environment evolves in a way that's quiet but unmistakable. In the earlier seasons, there's often a kind of dismissal in how he engages with her, a tendency to overlook, to move past, to maintain control of the conversation. But over time, something shifts. The dismissiveness doesn't disappear, but it softens. The reactions become more varied. There are moments of attentiveness that feel new. Moments where he pauses, where he listens just a little longer than before. And those moments, they matter. Because they reveal something that isn't always visible in the louder conflicts. A capacity for connection that exists alongside everything else. And that coexistence is key to understanding how Archie changes. Because he doesn't become a different person. He doesn't abandon his beliefs or adopt a new worldview. But he becomes more layered, more responsive, more aware, even if that awareness isn't fully articulated. And that awareness shows up in small ways. In hesitation, in tone, in the space between reactions. Now place all of this within the structure of the show itself, that living room where so much of the action unfolds, where conversations are the primary engine of storytelling, and you start to see how the environment shapes this gradual evolution. Because the living room doesn't allow escape. It keeps Archie in constant proximity to challenge, to disagreement, to perspectives that don't align with his own. And that constant exposure, that repetition, it has an effect. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over time. Because even the most rigid beliefs are influenced by repeated interaction. Not necessarily changed, but pressured, reshaped at the edges. And that's exactly what happens here. Archie's worldview remains largely intact, but the way he exists within it becomes more complex, more reactive, more nuanced. And that nuance is what defines his journey. Because by the later seasons, What you see isn't a transformed character, but a more layered one. A person who still holds onto the same core ideas, but who has been shaped by years of interaction, years of conflict, years of moments that didn't resolve but didn't disappear either. And those years show. They're present in the way he carries himself, in the way he approaches conversations, in the subtle differences between how he reacts now and how he reacted before. And that kind of change, that slow, cumulative, almost invisible evolution, it's rare in television. Because it requires patience. It requires consistency. It requires a willingness to let a character grow without announcing that growth. And it requires a performance that can sustain that level of detail over time, which is exactly what delivers. Because none of this works without that control, that ability to hold onto the essence of the character while allowing these small shifts to emerge naturally. And that's what makes Archie's journey across 9 seasons feel so real. Not because it leads to a clear destination, but because it mirrors how people actually change. Slowly, unevenly, sometimes without even realizing it. And when you look at it that way, when you stop searching for a moment where everything becomes different and instead start noticing the accumulation of small changes, the journey becomes clearer. Not simpler, but deeper. And that depth, that quiet, persistent evolution, is what makes Archie Bunker one of the most compelling long-form character studies television has ever produced.